questions and comments from commissioners, but not from stakeholders, and so that would come a little bit later, just before one of the breaks. So I would expect that with 3.5 hours of work to be presented and discussed, plus the potential adoption of the report, that we should still be on track for completing by 5 p.m. today. Thanks, Chair.
All right, thanks very much, Dave. Chris, did you have any comments or suggestions for today?
I don't think so, Paul. I think just go through the agenda as it's laid out. I don't know that, I have no idea how many public comments we might get on the MSAB report, but just wondering if that might take a little longer than we're thinking, just because we might get public comment.
Yeah, good point, Chris. Well, if we get lots of comments, that's good. It'd be good to get some feedback and understand what people are thinking. So I guess without waiting anymore, I'll turn it over to you, Dave, or Dr. Hicks, to get us started on the report on the MSAB.
Thanks, Chair. So we'll just call on Dr. Hicks and ask the Secretariat to put up his presentation for an update on the IPHC Management Strategy Evaluation.
Good morning, everyone. Just make sure my microphone's working. We have confirmation you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Alan.
Good morning, commissioners, and good to see everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. Maybe this is good afternoon for Commissioner Oliver. Not sure where he's at, but anyways, I'd like to present the Management Strategy Evaluation results, agenda item 8.1, and you can find these results as well as more broad description of a lot of different things in document 11, and note that there is a revision 1 which was posted I believe about 2 weeks ago, and that revision 1 reflects some of the outcomes of MSAB 16. So I'm going to go quickly through these first few slides. They're a bit of review, and then I want to focus a bit more on the results near the end. So as a reminder, management strategy evaluation is this process we've embarked on for more than 6 years now, and is to evaluate harvest strategies and develop a management procedure that is robust to uncertainty and meets defined objectives. So it's important to remember we have goals and objectives that have been defined within the MSAB process and within the commission meetings. Management procedures have been identified, and those have been simulation tested and evaluated through the simulation and evaluation steps. And that's where the MSE framework was created to do that simulation. And then we have the application, and that's where we're at this year and coming up to the annual meeting. Is through this simulation and evaluation process, is there a management procedure we'd like to implement? So we've talked about objectives. I'm going to review these really briefly, not go into detail. It's just a lot. And we did this last year. So they have not changed since the Commission approved them early in 2020 at the intersessional meeting. But we have primary biological objectives, and these are basically maintaining female spawning biomass above 20% of unfished levels. So maintaining biomass out there, that's a great objective, as well as maintaining biomass in the different biological regions. So making sure biomass is spread out among the convention area. And I want to note that these percentages, these minimum percentages that we want to keep the biomass above, these were defined in an ad hoc manner, just looking at previous data. So there could be some additional work done in identifying more meaningful percentages of, for this objective. Second objective is a target spawning biomass. And a target spawning biomass is more related to the fishery, because keeping the spawning biomass around this target will maximize either economic yield or sustainable yield. And that's the purpose of this one. So we've defined it as a fishery objective, but it's basically keeping the spawning biomass or maintaining the spawning biomass around 36% of unfished levels. And it's not keeping it right at that level, it's just meaning it'll fluctuate around that level, being above 50% of the time and below 50% of the time. We have fishery objectives related to stability in the mortality levels, or the TCEY. And we have these at the coastwide level, as well as at the regulatory area level. And notice we don't have defined any sort of tolerance or things like that. The MSAB and the MSc team and the IPHC Secretariat really wanted to evaluate these and look at the trade-offs between them instead of being limited whether or not they met this tolerance. And so we just wanted to use these as more to look and really compare the management procedures. So we have two different stability metrics. One is what we call AC, or is annual change in the TCEY, and that is actually how much the TCEY changes from year to year. So did it go up by 20% or did it go up by 5%? And the statistic here is the probability that in any 3 or more years out of 10-year period, did that TCEY change by more than 15%? So did we see at least 3 years where it changed by more than 15% up or down in that period? And that's a measure of stability, to just see it's not happening that often or it's happening very often. And the second metric here is called average annual variability, and that's just an average of the variability over that 10-year period. And it can have it's a slightly different way to look at it, because you can have a very large change in 1 year and very small change in 9 years, and that average will actually be somewhat small. So it's just two different ways to look at stability, and I think they're both useful. The final set of objectives are fishery objectives related to yield. And again, there are coastwide objectives, the coastwide TCEY, as well as regulatory area specific objectives here. And those regulatory area specific ones are optimizing the TCEY among the regulatory areas, as well as the percentage. So we're looking at the percentage of TCEY in each regulatory area. So is 3A getting 30% or 40% of the coastwide TCEY, for example? And then two more objectives looking at minimum TCEYs. What's the average minimum observed in a regulatory area, and then the minimum percentage within a regulatory area. So a number of different statistics to look at there, all of which are useful. Those are the objectives, and then the next box that you saw early in this presentation were management procedures, and this is really important. This is the definition of management procedures that we're actually going to test through the simulation process. So these need to be really specified so that we can code them in the computer code and see how they work. So as a reminder, we have this harvest strategy policy shown in this illustration here. And the management procedure is all of that before you get to the decision-making step. And so we have two components of the management procedure, and that's the coastwide scale over here, which is determined by the fishing intensity and results in a coastwide TCEY. And that coastwide TCEY is then subsequently distributed to the regulatory areas. And there's a number of different ways of which that distribution procedure may occur. And then I note once the stock assessment or the harvest policy is presented in terms of this distribution to the regulatory areas, there's this decision-making step, and that really occurs at the annual meeting and the discussion among commissioners. And this is what Dr. Cox was talking about yesterday. It would be nice to be able to really identify how these decisions are being made, and at least be able to put in some simulation process that mimics this decision-making process. So what we focused on at the MSAB and what the MSc team really liked to think about were the elements of the management procedures. And by elements, I mean we can create a management procedure by piecing together these multiple elements. So for example, at the scale level, at this coastwide level, we have the SPR and the control rule, and as well as constraints at the coastwide level. And so these are all different elements we can apply into a management procedure that can then create multiple different management procedures at the coast-wide level. And as I mentioned, there's many different ways to do distribution, and that could include regional stock distribution, distributing the stock to the biological regions first and then to regulatory areas, or you might distribute it directly to regulatory areas. And there's a number of different ways to do that. Using the FIS survey to calculate stock distribution and distribute it that way, incorporating these relative harvest rates where some regulatory areas have lower harvest rates than others, and then even introducing these agreements. And there's even more elements that can be introduced in thinking about putting together management procedures. But these are basically the elements we've looked at this year and pieced together a number of different management procedures this way. So the Management Strategy Advisory Board proposed 11 different management procedures for evaluation in 2020, and this can be found in many appendices. The first appendix it appeared in was the report for MSAB 15. And you can see here there's multiple different elements. I'm not going to present this whole table, that's just a bit too much. But instead, we thought, and many people appreciate this table of the 11 different management procedures along the different columns. So we have A through K at the top. And then down the rows here, we have some different elements, and the dark color indicates if that element was actually part of the management procedure. So at the top here, we have these bluish colored cells are related to the coast-wide scale. And there are multiple different SPRs tested for all of these, so that's not included in this table. But other elements include a constraint of 15% on the TCY, so that TCY cannot change by more than 15% each year. If the management procedure says it should change by more than 15%, it's constrained to only change by 15%. And you'd see all but one of the management procedures includes that constraint. So MPA is unconstrained change in the coastwide TCY. There's another element where we have a maximum fishing intensity buffer of 36%, which is basically saying we're allowed to account for certain other elements by increasing the fishing intensity up to an SPR of 36%. But we will not exceed 36% in the estimated SPR. So that's how this table works. Here in yellow are different methods of using stock distribution. And I'll note, for example, we have, this is a common one we're using now. And then this one here is averaging over a 5-year period. So basically smoothing stock distribution to potentially avoid any abrupt changes in a regulatory area. And some other elements there in the pinkish red is different methods or elements for relative harvest rates. And I'll note here that we have what we're currently using in our interim management procedure at the top of that. And then the next one is having equal harvest rates across areas, regulatory areas 2 through 4C, D, and E, and then a lower harvest rate only in regulatory area 4B. And then the green is the current agreements of 1.65 million pounds in 2A, and that's a fixed TCY, as well as the formula percentage for 2B. And then I note there's an additional element here of a national share of a 20% fixed percentage of the TCY going to regulatory area 2B. And that occurs in MPF. So what you can notice in this table, there's a lot of management procedures that really investigate the effect of one of these elements. So for example, MPA can be compared to MPB just to see the effect of a constraint. And that's a really useful way to look at this. But with 11 management procedures and all of these different elements, that's a lot of different comparisons to make. So I'll try to summarize that into a more digestible form throughout this presentation. So that, you know, the MSD team put a lot of work into putting this framework together this year, a lot of coding of operating models, and then the closed loop simulations, integrating the management procedure into these simulations. And I'm only going to present the results of all of that work in the one slide here, and that is this conditioned operating model. We talked about this a lot with the SRB and the MSAB, but in the interest of time, I'll just present the operating model, which is a multi-region model, meaning we're modeling the movement between the 4 biological regions. And we have actually 33 fisheries where we have fisheries in each regulatory area. We have fisheries for directed commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, subsistence, etc., non-directed also. So there's a lot of different fisheries. There's a lot of, there's 4 different regions. And we fit this operating model to multiple sources of information, such as observed stock distribution, the observed WPUE, or actually NPUE from the survey, as well as predicted spawning biomass from the assessment in the past. And what you can see here is in the pink, I guess, pink, orange, red color, is the results from the ensemble assessment, showing the uncertainty from that ensemble. Going back in this far in time, there's only 2 models in the ensemble, and then this period and the more recent is the 4 models in the ensemble. And the blue, the dark blue thick line, is the median from the operating model, all the simulations. And so you think that's the sort of central tendency of the operating model. And then the blue shaded area is the uncertainty 5th and 95th interval, as well as some individual trajectories of those thin lines. And so the thin line is one individual trajectory. And the way we operate these simulations is we take one of these trajectories and then project into the future with that management procedure. So we might have one case where it's down low, another case where it's up high, and then our results are averaged over all of those trajectories and all of those simulations. And that's why we'll see variability in the results, which is really important to characterize. So that brings us to the results. And there's a number of different ways that I'll present the results this morning. First, I'll present some pretty detailed results, even by regulatory area. And then I'll go into some summaries of the results. And those summaries hopefully will be a useful way to look at this in overall picture. But first, some really specific results. Here we have the coast-wide sustainability metrics being the relative spawning biomass. So this is long-term relative spawning biomass as a percentage of unfished spawning biomass. And then along the horizontal x-axis here are the different management procedures where we have, say, management procedure A with various SPR values, so various fishing intensities in there, where we have in purple an SPR 50%, which is a low fishing intensity, and then a blue circle is a high fishing intensity with an SPR 36%. And so you can see the stock status, or the stock is driven to lower levels with higher fishing intensity. That's good, that's expected. And I'll note here we have the 20% relative spawning biomass noted by the dotted line in the darker red area. And then the 36%, which is our target, is the top of this lighter red area here. And so the objective there is to actually maintain it around that target, being above and below it, but not going below the 20% very often is the other objective. And so what I want to note here is that none of these management procedures really get close to the 20%, and that's because of the 30-20 control rule. I will also note that the red diamond here is right at an SPR 43%, and you can see that just below that would be corresponding to the target. So somewhere in between an SPR 43% and 40% is where you would meet that target objective exactly for at least management procedure A. But overall, you can see there's not a lot of difference across any of these management procedures, except if you look really closely, management procedure D, all of these are slightly lower. You can see this red diamond is slightly closer to the target. And that's because management procedure D was the one with that maximum buffer, meaning that it allowed the input SPR, say 43%, to be exceeded to account for some of the agreements. So that's the coast-wide sustainability metrics. And those coast-wide sustainability metrics match with the coast-wide MSE results pretty closely. So I think there's some really good correspondence there. These are stability performance metrics, and I'll go through these quickly. We have the average annual variability on top and the annual change on the bottom. And what I really want to notice is just look at this from afar. We have the different SPR values for these different things. And what you notice is there's a couple of standouts. One, the stability, or actually the variability in the TCY, the yield, is very high. So we have a lot more variability in yield with management procedure A. And again, that is that unconstrained management procedure. So that's expected. We're not constraining at the coast-wide level, and so it can vary a lot more. And as you increase the fishing intensity, the variability also increases. So you get less stability the harder you fish. The other standout here is MPD, where you notice the annual change. There's a higher probability that you will exceed a change of 15% in at least 3 years out of 10. But on average, the variability is lower over that 10-year period. So that again is that difference between those two statistics, and it's interesting to see those, and that is why the MSAB has decided to bring in both of these statistics as measure of stability, because they're really looking at different things. On average, stability is not too bad, but there's a few big changes that can occur, and that's the way to think about that. But otherwise, on the coast-wide level, stability is not much different between the other management procedures, lettered management procedures. In terms of the coast-wide yield, again, looking across all of these management procedures, there's not a lot of difference. There's a lot of variability in yield. These simulations showed yield could be from 20 million pounds up to, in some of them, 70, 80 million pounds. But one thing I will note is that MPD stands out here as you don't go to those lower levels. And again, I believe that's because that management procedure is allowed to increase the fishing intensity to account for certain agreements. But not a lot of difference in yield, but when you look really closely, you can see 1 or 2 million pound differences. All right, these plots are pretty noisy, hard to interpret. Let's not get too caught up in all of the dots and all of the colors here, but I just want to show again some general trends. What these plots are showing now, we have the stability metrics again, but we're showing the individual regulatory areas for only an SPR 43%, which is our current interim reference point. And so we have individual regulatory areas like 2A is in green, 4B is in the black triangle up top. And so you can see there's some big differences between the regulatory areas. So 4B actually has a lot of variability, a lot of change in the TCY from year to year, whereas 2A in at least these early A through E has a very, very low variability or high stability, and that's because that's a fixed 1.65 million pounds. So that makes sense. So what are the general trends here? You see across here, unconstrained at the coast-wide level improves the stability at all the regulatory area levels a little bit. You can see not having that agreement for 2A increases its variability up to about the same level as other regulatory area levels. You can see there's some differences in 2B depending on the agreement. So for example, F is a 20% share and its stability is quite good for 2B with that share. But what I also wanted to note is just looking at overall regulatory areas, when you get out to MPs J and K, big improvements in this stability, especially for 4B. And what these two management procedures are doing is they're averaging that stock distribution. They're smoothing out the stock distribution So instead of saying, for example, from 2019 to 2020, you saw from Dr. Stewart's presentation the estimates of stock distribution in regions 2 and regions 3 changed by quite a bit. They had
Just bear with us for a moment.
Sorry about that. I had a brief network connection issue. Sorry about that. I had a brief network connection issue. Just want to make sure I'm back and you can all hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just back up briefly. I was saying I don't think that this plot is the best way to look at the yield, or actually, sorry, that was stability. So yeah, so on the yield metrics, I'm saying there's some very slight differences by regulatory areas, but I don't think this is the best way to look at the yield trade-offs between regulatory areas, and I'll show a different way in a moment. So I apologize for that network error. So a tool that the MSC team put together is called the Msc Explorer, and this is a very useful tool for any individual, stakeholder, commissioner, scientist, secretariat to look at and dial down on some really specifics they want to look at if they want to answer some specific questions. But also in this tool are ways to get a broad overview of all the management procedures being evaluated. There's a link here. There's also a link on the management strategy evaluation page on the IPHC.int website. So you can go there. And yeah, so feel free to play around with that. I also note there's info document 04, which provides an explanation of how to use the Explorer tool. It may be possible if you do want to see a quick example, I could show you an example later today. One thing the team thought would be helpful to evaluate a broad set of management procedures is to provide sort of these color-coded tables. So for example, we can ask the question, are these sustainability objectives met? And that is, so for example, look at the very bottom row here, maintaining a female spawning biomass above that limit reference point of 20%. And so the actual numbers in here are the probabilities that that you go below that limit reference point. And so remember, we had a tolerance defined of 0.05. So all of these numbers are less than 0.05, so they pass that objective. They meet that objective. However, if one of these did not meet the objective, it would be colored red. And so the top 4 rows are maintaining a minimum proportion of female spawning biomass in each of these different regions. And you'll probably note quite quickly, which is the purpose of this table, that you can identify which ones are not being met. And you see that in 4B, there is a high probability of the coast-wide spawning biomass dropping below 2% of the coast-wide level. Now, I noted earlier that these percentages, this 2%, 10% of stuff, are a bit defined ad hoc, and it would be useful to do some more research and define better ones. So we looked into this through our simulations, and we found that even without fishing, that our simulations showed that this objective was not met. So we felt like some more research would be useful to do here. We also noted that in our simulations, at the levels going below 2% to say 1.5% of the coastwide spawning biomass, it still maintained biomass in biological region 4B, and it still was a contributor to the TCY and stuff. What these simulations are showing us, given the parameters and the assumptions we've made in this model, is that 4B is quite variable. You saw that in the stability metrics as well. 4B is quite variable because fish are moving out. It's really affected a lot by recruitment, which is also variable. So some more research to do with those assumptions, as well as an appropriate percentage here. So the MSAB has evaluated all of these management procedures, even though this single objective was not met according to the current set of objectives. So we'll move forward with all of those management procedures. The remaining objectives did not have a tolerance defined, so we couldn't say whether the objective was met or not, but we can rank them according to how they perform against each other. So I just want to give you a really quick example how the ranking occurred. So for example, we have the 11 management procedures across the top here, and we have the median TCY. So this is say the mortality limit coastwide. And this is just an example, I think, from one of the runs. You see we have the different levels for all of these different management procedures, where management procedure D produced the highest yield, and management procedures GHIJ produced the lowest yield. And rounding to this first decimal place, they all are actually tied. So obviously D is the best performing, so it gets a 1 and a light blue color in its cell. And then the second best was management procedure A, and so it gets a 2, and then we get a 3, and now we see B and F are tied for 4th place. So they both get a 4, but then the next place gets a 6 because that takes 4 and 5. This is one method of ranking. And then we have 2 tied for 6, and then all the remainders get 8. This is one method of ranking that we chose to use. We can use other methods, and we can have discussions about that. But the nice thing about this is it just shows you quick at a glance which management procedures perform the best relative to all the others. And so we'll use these rank tables to evaluate them against all of the other objectives. And this is nice. We have in the Msc Explorer, you can look at each individual regulatory area, but we also have tables that then take the average over all regulatory areas with equal weighting. And so this shows the averaging, say, the stability over all regulatory areas, and that's why now the rankings have these decimals, because they're averages. But it basically provides a way to look at all of the objectives, all of the management procedures across the columns, and to look at them and say which ones are the better performing management procedures. And looking at this table in terms of just averaging over the regulatory areas and all the different objectives is you tend to get darker numbers on this side of the table and lighter numbers on this side of the table, especially that J and K show a lot of lighter cells, better ranks. So that's one way to look at it. And then you can summarize it even further into these general objectives, these 3 general objectives, 3 general fishery objectives: maintaining around the target, the catch variability, and providing directed fishery yield. And so what you can see is then again averaging over all of these, where you don't need to average 2.1 because there's only one objective in there, but it gives you an idea that there tend to be darker ones over here, except D seems to be a very well performer, and lighter ones on this side. And so what the MSAB did is, during the evaluation at the MSAB, they identified, I can't remember exactly how many, I think 3 or 4 of these management procedures as tier 1, sort of the highest, best performing ones. And that included D, and that also included J. And you can see they perform well in terms of yield and stability, as well as maintaining the spawning biomass around the target. So that's one way to help with the evaluation and really start to narrow down a broad set of management procedures over a large number of objectives. So that brings us back to elements. What sort of elements were we looking at with these management procedures, and how did they perform? So in terms of results of the elements, the MSE team has identified some of the results here. The SPR obviously has a large effect on the coastwide and the population metrics, as we saw. This is the fishing intensity. The harder you fish, the smaller the stock gets. And that's not bad. We do want to reduce the stock to maximize, or get to maximum sustainable yield or maximum economic yield. But that coastwide effect therefore affects all regulatory area levels. And the constraints at the coastwide level reduce that variability in the TCUI at the coastwide level. And I note that we tested here mainly just the 15% constraint. There are some additional runs as just comparisons. They are not complete runs, but looking at slow up, fast down, and multi-year quotas as well. So there are different constraint options to look at. Stock distribution. One really clear result was averaging the stock distribution or smoothing that, and we chose a 5-year period here. Other periods of years can be chosen, but averaging really reduced the variability and stabilized the TCUI in many of the regulatory areas, especially 4B. So that was a really interesting result. And just to note, that was in Management Procedure J. Using all sizes instead of 032 had small differences for each regulatory area, but we think some more research could be done into that. And then distributing to the region first had small different possibilities for each regulatory area, but we only tested one very simple way to then go from the region to each individual regulatory area within a region, and there's many possibilities for that, and therefore some more research could be done with that method as well. Relative harvest rates, so we looked at relative harvest rates of being 0.75 or 1 in regulatory areas 3B, 4A, and 4C, D, and E. And we noted there was a slight, very small reduction in the coastwide TCUI, as well as improved stability at the coastwide level. And as you would expect, with increasing the relative harvest rate, increased the TCUI, but that also meant that you had to decrease the TCUI in the areas that to compensate for that increase in the harvest rate. So that's sort of that trade-off to be examined there. We also had a long discussion with the SRB as well as the MSAB on these relative harvest rates, and we felt that the assumptions about migration in the operating model are going to be a big driver on the results of this. And it might be a little premature to make any concrete recommendations on relative harvest rates at this time without examining alternative assumptions about migration to really see how they do affect the stock as a whole, as well as at the individual regulatory area level. So potentially more research there as well. The 2A and 2B agreements. Overall, there's definitely trade-offs between these regulatory areas and others, and you can see that in the yield. With the agreements, more yield tended to go to region or regulatory areas 2A and 2B, and that had to be compensated by the other regulatory areas. And I want to note, too, that the benefit of these simulations is you can see the effect on the spawning biomass. So this is long-term percentage of spawning biomass in Region 2 across the different regulatory areas with an SPR 46%, I guess I showed here. But what you notice is that there's some dots that are low, and there's some dots that tend to be higher, around 14.5 or 15%, and around 17 to 18% here. And those are basically the low dots are the ones with the agreements, and the high dots are the ones without the agreements for 2A and 2B. And so you see it just has an effect on the percentage of spawning biomass in Region 2, which is expected. Whether that's good or bad, you'd probably have to look at other metrics to determine that. So overall, generally, the coastwide TCUI is mainly affected by SPR, and the SPR 43% still performs well. And I note that a SPR 40% drops below that target more than 50% of the time, so that may be undesirable based on that objectives. But an SPR 42% would probably get you even closer to that target with higher potential yields, and then you might want to look at other metrics such as stability to see how that works. But it's definitely in agreement with the previous coast-wide MSC results in terms of the coast-wide general conclusions here. 30-20 control rule really keeps that spawning biomass above the limit of 20%, and constraints maintain stability of the coast-wide TCUY. In terms of regulatory areas, there's a lot of trade-offs between areas, and we expected this. The MPs without the agreements tended to perform better when considering all of the IPHC regulatory areas, and that's when looking equally across all regulatory areas, they tended to perform better in terms of yield and stability. I note that MPD, the one with the maximum fishing intensity where it's allowed to increase from your input SPR, that performed well, and interestingly, because it allowed the coast-wide TCY to have more variability to accommodate those agreements, which resulted in more stability at the area level. So there's this trade-off between coast-wide stability in the TCY and the regulatory area level stability of the TCY. And this would be really useful to look at and follow up on in the future as well. I do note that MPD also results in a higher fishing intensity than that input. So if you're operating on an input SPR 43%, that's what your reference level is. You actually be operating at a higher fishing intensity, maybe at like a 41%, because of you're allowing it to increase. The variability in the stock distribution, so the use of stock distribution to distribute the TCUY has a large effect on stability, and we saw that averaging that improves stability by quite a bit, especially for 4B. And then different metrics would be useful. There's MPK, which had stock distribution fixed for a period of 5 years, and it could only change every 5th year. And it was an average of those 5 years, but it didn't change every year, it changed every 5th year. And the metrics that we're presenting here were not really capturing the potential change every 5th year. So some different metrics would be useful to evaluate MPK. So overall, the best performing MPs are D and J, where D had more variability in the coast-wide TCY, but that allowed flexibility for the area level. And that SPR is not known exactly. MPJ had more stability coast-wide. This is the averaging of the stock distribution, and higher TCY in all the areas other than 2A and 2B. But noting that you could potentially go to an SPR 42% and get a slightly bit more yield using MPJ, for example. I include this picture not to go into the individual details of all of these, but to show that there are trade-offs between looking at just specifically D and J, MPs D and J, those procedures, in that sometimes the regulatory area might decrease, some regulatory areas increase for the different metrics. And so each plot here is a different metric. And so I don't want to go into the details, but just mention that there are trade-offs between all the regulatory areas when looking at even these two management procedures. So then getting back to elements, to identify the important elements, MPD had that SPR buffer, allowing that flexibility to accommodate the agreements, and it also included the agreements for 2A and 2B, whereas MPJ did not, but MPJ incorporated the 5-year average for stock distribution. So as a reminder, smoothing the stock distribution improved the stability and yield. The SPR buffer allowed for the agreements, but with increased risk to the stock. The SPR could possibly be reduced slightly for MPJ, allowing a higher fishing intensity that would increase the yield slightly. So just to finish up real quick, and thanks for your patience on this, the possible work between now and IM097, if the commission did decide to direct the MSC team to do some additional work, we could bring some things to IM097 if that's desirable. And that is to look at the operating model and improve that, for example, to introduce some alternative migration scenarios, to investigate that and maybe get a better picture of relative harvest rates, as well as the robustness of all of these, especially these two optimal MPs, D and J. The Secretariat might also be directed to develop a new management procedure to simulation test that combines elements in a different way. And that's why we really wanted to present the elements here, is if you're like, yeah, I want to see the buffer, the agreements, and the smoothing on the 032, we could do that, and we could run that. I'm not saying we could run another 11 management procedures, but 1 or 2 is definitely possible before the annual meeting. So some action items are, 1, we're just looking for the commission to approve or recommend the use of this MSC framework for the evaluation of these. This is a brand new framework that's been reviewed by the SRB, the external review, as well as the MSAB has seen it, and they all have suggested using that for now. And also recommending a management procedure that best meets the commission objectives and accounts for trade-offs between yield and yield stability in all of these IPHC regulatory areas. And then at the IM, of course, again, if there's any directives for work to be done before the annual meeting, that would be useful to know, and we can address that as best possible. Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience on that.
Dr. Hicks, I'll just see if there are questions for you. While people think about their questions, I was struck by a couple things myself. I think you said back on slide 11, you incorporated everything into one slide, all the work the MSE team had undertaken over the last while. Must be a challenging slide to put together. I guess seriously though, Alan, I would congratulate the MSE team for all the work they have done to get to this point, to provide the analysis of the 11 management procedures and show us the results and the implications of each of those with the objectives that have been developed by the MSAB, which also I would say extend my congratulations to the MSAB group, who has invested quite a number of years to get us to this stage of exploring these 11 management procedures against the objectives that were developed over a course of a number of years as well. So I'll just see if there are any questions from commissioners for you. I see that Chris has a question.
Yeah, and it was definitely.
Yeah, and I'll echo the thanks for all the hard work, Alan. And I guess I have probably a few questions, but they might not be for Alan. Some comments. On slide 32, Alan, you said one of the recommendations was to recommend a management procedure that best meets the objectives. Were you suggesting we narrow the field to a single management procedure at this meeting? Because I had a follow-up question along those lines. It's probably for either Dr. Wilson or my fellow commissioners.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Oliver. The real goal of management strategy evaluation is to identify a best performing management procedure that then can be put into application. And I see that as the goal of this management strategy evaluation. And really these recommendations here on this slide are more recommendations to be brought forward to the annual meeting, not at the interim meeting. So here I think more the interim meeting thoughts are more this slide. Is there anything else the commission might need coming into the annual meeting to help them with the decision-making process of either choosing a management procedure to put into application, so updating that current interim management or harvest policy that we have identified, or directing future work of the management strategy evaluation itself.
Thank you, Alan. And maybe I should hold off, Paul, and see if other commissioners have questions for Alan, because I have a couple of questions that are for yourself and the other commissioners.
Okay, I see that Richard has a question and Peter has one as well, so maybe we'll come back then, Chris. So, Richard?
Yes, Alan. You kind of mentioned a few things that you felt that the MSC could do to improve the decision-making processes on the MP. I'm not quite sure if your suggestions were between now and the annual meeting or beyond, but you mentioned some other constraints that might be of value, like slow up, fast down, or averaging. You mentioned that we need to kind of answer this question about the possibility of maybe distributing to regions first, and then going to regulatory areas. And you also mentioned that we need to find a better answer for migration that might shed some more lights on harvest rates coast-wide. So these you mentioned as, you know, potential projects that MSC could take. Were your thoughts regarding this beyond 2021 or 2022, or are your thoughts that some of these could shed some light between now and the annual meeting?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Yamada. That is a really great question. The management strategy evaluation is an analysis that is not a quick analysis. As we've seen, we've been working on it for many years, but even now that we have this framework, we've put together this framework to really expedite analyses that we want to see. And I think we have that framework together now and can answer questions very quickly. But it still takes sometimes weeks to do the simulations. So I think between now and the annual meeting, if there is one or two questions that the commissioners would like to get further insight on, the MSC team can go away and do their best to add to that. So for example, we could introduce some alternative migration assumptions, do some simulations to test the robustness of the relative harvest rates, for example, and just see how that performs. But I think most of those recommendations are beyond 2021, just the limited amount of time before the annual meeting. And that is, oh boy, I just saw a number of cameras drop. I just want to confirm that commissioners are back in. I'll wait to hear back from Commissioner Yamada and just to make sure that I've answered his question, or if he'd like me to repeat the answer.
Yeah, let's just give it a minute or two here, Alan. I see people starting to join.
Yeah.
At least as far as commissioners go, I couldn't speak for other participants, whether they were disconnected as well.
Okay. I see. Commissioner Yamada, was there a break in my answer there, or would you like me to repeat that answer? I think right now you're muted still, Commissioner Yamada.
Can you hear me?
There you go. Yes.
Yeah, so I was just trying to get a sense of what was in the realm of feasibility between now and interim meeting, and your answer, I guess, is you could do it, but you would like to be more focused on our ask. So yeah, that's definitely you know, a consideration for us when we go forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so yeah, really a lot of these questions are beyond 2021.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I see that Peter has a question.
Good morning, Dr. Hicks, and thank you for that presentation. And again, thank both you and the MSAB for doing such good work, and you came to some interesting results. My question is about unstated objectives, and I've heard you discuss them in the past. And I was curious if through this process you felt that all the objectives that were have been stated, and if there were any unstated objectives, what were they?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner DeGrief. I think in any MSc analysis, there's always going to be unstated objectives. And that's part of the reason that in the Msc Explorer, I think we have over 600 different performance metrics. And that is not only to help with, okay, if two management procedures meet all these primary objectives similarly, you can start looking at other metrics. But I think some stakeholder groups, some different people involved in the MSc process want to look at specific metrics that might not be in the current primary set. That being said, it is interesting. We've identified the objectives for stability and yield as pretty general objectives so that we could actually evaluate the trade-offs between the regulatory areas. And that's a real key part of management strategy evaluation, is evaluating the trade-offs and looking how one objective changes with a different objective. So for example, how yield in 3A changes with yield in 4C, D, and E when the relative harvest rates are different between the western areas, and seeing that increasing the relative harvest rate in western areas increases the yield for 4C, D, and E, but decreases it for 3A. And those sorts of trade-offs are really important to look at. Out of that evaluation process, yes, you're going to begin to identify objectives that are not clearly stated in our primary set. And I think that's okay for right now, because we know that a stakeholder in 4C, D, and E would like to increase their yield, but also a stakeholder in 3A would like to increase their yield, perhaps. So I think we can have some of those unstated objectives. And I think the objective set we have now identifies those trade-offs and can allow the commissioners to have that discussion of those trade-offs and make the decision. And that's the hard part, is making the decision and balancing the trade-offs as best as possible. But so I'm not sure that, in my eye, the management procedures right now there are some objectives actually put into the management procedures, like a fixed 1.65 for 2A, which has been, was expressed last year and put into an agreement. That could be defined as an unstated objective for a particular regulatory area. But how then do you again balance that as an objective with trade-offs in other regulatory areas? I don't know. So just to summarize, I think the current set of objectives that we have are a nice set of objectives to balance or to evaluate the trade-offs between all of the different regulatory areas. And perhaps there are some very specific objectives within regulatory areas that are not currently in the primary set.
Okay, thank you. I do have one other question, and it pertains to slide 16 and slide 25, and you don't have to scroll to them, but I noticed that the quantiles are different. One, you're looking at 5 to 95 quantile, and another and these are to do with yield, you're looking at 25 to 75. I'm just trying to understand what the difference is and why I look at them from different.
So let me just make sure I get the question correct. Your question is about the why we've presented quantiles 25, 75%, as well as 5 and 95%.
They're just different in certain slides, and I'm just curious, why and what difference that would make, or just explain that.
Sure. Yeah. Great question, Commissioner DeGrief. And working with the MSAB, we've the MSc team and the development of the Msc Explorer and our presentation of the results, we came up with those 4 different options for quantiles. And quantiles or percentiles, they're also called. You can think of it about as a 5% per quantile is 5% of the simulations showed a value less than that. And what was happening in, especially with the yield, is you saw, I think it's slide 16, as you said, where the distribution of those quantiles is so large that the yield can change from, values of 10 million pounds to over 100 million pounds, that we felt looking at 5 to 95 percentiles, those quantiles, those just introduced such a large range that the MSAB specifically felt, let's look at what happens, 25% of the time with a 25 and a 75% quantile. So it's basically just a different way to look at the distribution of the results and get an idea of, is your core simulations within this 25 to 75%, and then you have a few that are way outside, and that can influence the 5 to 95s. So when we're actually doing the evaluation, many of the times we plot all of those different quantiles, and we can see how big these what's called tails are. Are there a few extreme simulations that are really driving that 5% quantile, but 25% is pretty close to the median? And it just gives us an idea of what the distribution of the results look like. Are we really bunched up around the median, or are we really spread out and there's a lot of variability?
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right. Neil, you had some questions.
Good morning, Dr. Hicks. I'll add my voice to the thanks to you and your team. I know there are others we don't necessarily see their faces on these calls, but that are working closely with you, so I wanted to acknowledge their work as well. I just have one question, which was about one of your closing comments about, the possibility of doing further work between now and the annual. I'm just wondering what those timelines might look like. I think there's a lot of information that's been shared here today, and I suspect, at least on our side, that we'll probably want to digest some of this and think about, what kinds of new combos might we be interested in seeing. But when would you need that kind of information by to be able to go away and do a few additional management procedures to have something ready in time for the annual meeting?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Davis, and thanks for the congratulations as well. It really was a team effort, and I just want to make sure that the MSc team is noted for the immense amount of work that they've done. Great question, and to be honest, there is not a lot of time before the due dates for the annual meeting, which I believe the documents for the annual meeting are due December 26th. I doubt I'm going to work on Christmas Day, so I'll probably have that document done maybe hopefully a week before Christmas. So putting that timeline in, that gives us about 4 weeks from now to do any additional results, incorporate them into a document. So to be honest, I think we would need any recommendation for work to be done before the annual meeting to occur by the end of today and be incorporated into the report for the IM. And noting that, then, at the annual meeting, we can then continue working beyond 2021. And I do note that's, commission discretion if they, I don't know if there's an intersessional meeting that might occur in between now and the annual meeting to provide further direction, but given the amount of time it takes to do these simulations and the limited amount of time before the annual meeting, I don't know that delaying that would be very prudent.
Okay, thank you.
Need to occur.
I have a couple of questions. I don't see Chris back online yet, but so going back to slide 16, I thought I heard you say, Alan, not the best way to look at yield. Oh, there he is. Chris is back. What did you mean by that? Did you have an alternative?
Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner Ryall. It is it's a messy way to look at yield, you might say. It's very a lot of information is on this slide, and we can look at things like, okay, I'm interested in say regulatory area 2B and the effect of the agreement, and then you start looking at the blue squares and how they differ between the MPs. But this is one of those ways to put a lot of information into one plot that you might sit there and I've actually looked at this plot for probably 30 minutes at a time, just analyzing different things. Within Msc Explorer, we have different options for displaying the results. And one of those options I showed briefly on this slide. This is actually a page from the Msc Explorer where you can choose the regulatory areas you want to see. So you can focus in on specific regulatory areas and very specific metrics that you want to look at to see those trade-offs and the specific management procedures. So it's I apologize for my confusion on slide 16. It is a very useful plot. It's just a very busy plot with probably a lot of information that takes a long time to digest. If you have more specific questions, there are alternative tools, alternative ways to present that.
Clarification. I have a question about just the ranking of the 11 management procedures. I guess I noticed, some of the management procedures didn't really change very much, but yet they had a different ranking. And so by ranking all those, is it best to use a ranking procedure? I know you're trying to provide us guidance out of the 11 management procedures, but some of them really are like, for example, C is 38.3 in comparison to 38.2 on B. So does that really necessitate a 3 to a 4?
Thank you, Commissioner Ryall. That's a very good point. A lot of discussion occurred at the MSAB about that. Another option within the Msc Explorer tool is the amount of rounding. And one option is to round to the nearest 1 million pound, which I believe in the next slide, this row, let me show you this row here, optimize average coastwide TCY. Well, this is the averaging over the areas. But your point is well taken, is that we recommend using the ranking procedures as a quick, broad tool to identify management procedures that are performing better. But we also recommend looking at the specific values and saying, okay, 3 and 4 is 38.2 versus 38.3. That probably is not really a meaningful difference given the amount of variability in these. So therefore, we can look at those together. And that is what the MSAB did by identifying these different tier levels. Is they looked at a lot of different objectives and metrics and identified them in these tier levels, as within each tier, they're performing similarly or have performance that is good for some areas and maybe not as good for others, but they wanted to make sure that those were highlighted.
Yes, I appreciate the challenge of trying to do this too. So another question I had, was, and Peter touched on this as well, I think it was the slide 24, and you spoke about relative harvest rates and impact of migration. It needs to be explored further, I think was your comment, or something similar to that. So that's what you're suggesting that would be useful for future work, or is critical that happens now?
I think that's up to the commission, how critical they would like to classify the investigation of relative harvest rates. The discussions at the MSAB are what really highlighted that that additional research should be done before making a final decision on the relative harvest rates, in that the migration is going to have a large effect on the outcome, especially on the coast-wide stock of differing harvest rates. And so the MSAB and discussions at the MSAB 16, where we'd like to have a little bit more analysis, a little bit more robustness testing, just to make sure that management procedure changing these relative harvest rates is robust. And then I remind the analysis that I presented last year at the annual meeting showed that in different decades that the productivity in these areas, in these western areas, was different, and that potentially, relative harvest rates 20 years ago, this was appropriate, but in 2020, maybe they can be adjusted to different levels with a higher relative harvest rate in these western areas. But that's a time-varying concept, so we just want to make sure we capture all of those things. What we could do between now and the annual meeting to investigate this would be limited, and we'd be able to do a much broader, more.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Maybe just one last question is along the lines of, well, actually, it's along the lines of the question that Neil asked, and I guess my view is that it's similar to Neil's. It's a lot of information that's been presented today, and to provide some direction on other things that we would like to look at, I think would be useful to have a bit of time to digest and consider what that may be. I heard you say that you would need something today, given the time frame you're talking about, roughly not even 4 weeks. So if the advice came like early next week, would that be too late to consider for direction, or is it you do need it today?
In all honesty, Commissioner Ryall is, and thanks for asking the question and working with us and realizing these timelines, is we've put together this framework, and a lot of help from the team putting together a whole paradigm that allows us to do as rapid as possible analyses. And I think if we had a week to simulate a new management procedure, we could do that. And so if we did have a device coming within the next week or so, that we could do our best to get it done, and potentially have some useful results for the commission to consider. And I will note that not a lot of suggestion or not a lot of recommendations now. That would introduce a lot of work for us to do, but we have servers in place that can run multiple simulations quite quickly, and we can do a few things quite quickly. So yeah, if things came in after today, we would be able to address them. If they came in the second week of December.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan. Neil, did you still have a question? I see your hand up. Okay, thanks, Neil. Chris, did you now have questions, comments?
Chris, I think you, or Commissioner Oliver, I think you need to.
I bring the term IT challenged. I think I bring it to a new level. Along the lines of Paul and Neil's question about what we do today, given the short timeline, that's sort of where I was at, because part of me would like to narrow things down and get to that slide 32 that Alan had, and eventually a single decision. I don't think we're there yet. Part of me would like to narrow it down and, for example, just advance tier 1 MPs. On the other hand, I don't think people have digested things enough to do that. I actually have some additional, quite specific model runs I would like to see. I would like to see a modified MPJ that uses a 5-year rolling average and actually has the U.S. pay for that 1.65 million pounds in 2A rather than some buffer from the TCEY. I would like to see a model run, and this, I'll just go ahead and put this out there, Mr. Chair. When we reached our interim agreement, we were pretty clear that we were uncomfortable with the weighting aspect of that being weighted toward what we thought was an artificially high 20% versus the actual FIS distribution. And then ultimately, we wanted to see a management procedure that was far more closely tied to that actual resource distribution. I realized that D is a tier 1. I was going to suggest that, and this also gets to some of the things we've heard, that I've heard over the past year or two, that when you look at this issue of stock distribution, it's more appropriately viewed in the context of the larger management areas than the individual regulatory areas. For example, if we're going to continue looking at a formulaic approach for 2B, maybe it's more appropriately tied to region 2 rather than coast-wide. So I was going to, for example, suggest a new MP that would be a formula of 50% of the FIS for 2B, 032, and 50% of the region 2 historic share, as an example. Those are two very specific examples that I was hoping to get. Maybe it's too soon to make those kind of decisions. I don't know. So with that sort of rambling intro, I pose the question back to the other commissioners is, what do we want to do? What do we need to do at this meeting versus the annual meeting? Because if not at this meeting, I would certainly like to have the option for the U.S. commissioners in January, in conjunction with discussion with the Canadian commissioners, to discuss some of these other tweaks to, for example, MPD and MPJ. And then there's the slide 30 there that gets to some of the point I was making. So while I want to get us narrowed down, I also want to look at a couple other modified management procedures, particularly for D and J. So I'll stop there and see what other commissioners' thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. I guess maybe I'll offer a couple of comments. One is that you outlined that during our discussions around the interim agreement, you were uncomfortable with the identification of the formula used for the share for 2B. I guess I would say equally, I expressed, as did other Canadian commissioners, the discomfort around the 1.65 for 2A. I think rather than having a debate about that at this point, I think it would be good if we could maybe have a discussion around some tweaks, if you will, as I think the language you used, to D and J, or maybe some other ones that we could think about, and maybe that's a discussion that we should have as commissioners, that we then bring forward back to Dr. Hicks to provide for at the annual meeting. And given the time frame that was just outlined by Alan, it sounds like if we had something by next week to him, he would be able to undertake those and bring them forward. But I take from his comments that if we ask him for too many, then we probably won't have them for the annual meeting, and it's probably like maybe 1 or 2 additional work items that could be developed and generated for the annual meeting.
Just quickly respond, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the spirit of what you just said. I just don't know if we don't do it today. I don't know when we do it outside of scheduling some intersessional meeting in the next week, which is certainly going to be a challenge for myself. Or we take this time between now and the annual meeting for each of us to be able to further digest what's on our plate now, and for each of us to come up with some type of each of us to be armed to come into the annual meeting with those suggestions, and perhaps that's an intersessional in January that could help us accomplish that. But I don't see us doing that in the next few days.
Yeah, I think it would be a challenge, Chris, for us as well. I mean, I think if we dropped everything and that's also on the plate for us, that we probably could, but that's not going to happen either. There's just too many things as well that are going on. I think it's more prudent, really, for each of us to probably go away from this interim meeting, have a time to digest what Dr. Hicks has presented to us today, which probably will generate a few questions, which will then lead to, as you suggested, maybe an intersessional meeting in January where we could then come to an agreement about what we would like to see the MSE team do going forward. I think maybe is a more prudent way to go.
And just to be clear, Mr. Chairman, by that, just so Alan doesn't freak out here, I wasn't suggesting that we would come up with something in January and expect those model runs to be handed to us necessarily at the annual meeting, but that we would use that annual meeting with public input, et cetera, to come to an agreement on what they would look at going forward. That's kind of the spirit I was thinking, the context.
Yes, sorry, I wasn't clear there. I fully agree with you. That was my intent as well. Yeah. I see that Bob has a hand up for a comment or a question. Go to you, Bob.
I was just going to say, after I'd read this as much as I could, and the explanation we got from Alan today, I liked Chris's idea of trying to focus on the Tier 1, but I didn't know, and I guess you've kind of talked it out, that for additional MPs, then would that be in early January you're talking about? Our meeting is in late January to discuss additional runs.
I think what Chris and I were coming to agreement on, or a proposal for other commissioners to consider, was that we would have an intersessional meeting in January that would potentially look at maybe some modifications to the existing management procedures, or it could be other ones to explore. But I think it would be asking for those to be run and developed, but not for the annual meeting, as Chris clarified, Bob.
Okay, I understand it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just see if any other commissioners have any other comments or questions on the way forward in particular. Richard.
Yes, I'd just like to be clear that when we do consider this, that we don't go backwards and retask MSAB or MSC with a whole lot of work that we spent a lot of time so far doing several years and defining objectives and coming up with these MPs that we look at really what's on the table in tier 1 and just make some tweaks, but not go back to ground zero again and have this extended over a long period of time. So that's my only comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. You're saying be narrow in our focus of what we're looking for and not go off on a whole new tangent. Appreciate that. Anyone else? So, Alan,
Sorry,
what I take from
yeah,
this?
I know.
Oh, go ahead there, Peter. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, no, just that, yeah, I would like time, like everyone else, to digest this and understand the implications and fully understand what the message is here before I'm ready to make a decision. And so, I'm not sure if I could do that within a week or whatever.
All right, thanks, Peter. Okay, Alan, I think you've heard the discussion that we will not be looking for you to work on a whole new suite of things between now and Christmas. So that's good news for you, I think. But we will be, I guess, David, having and wanting to set up an intersessional meeting for the commissioners in January, and we can figure that out offline later as far as how we want to move forward and what we would consider at that meeting.
Certainly, that sounds good.
Or, Mr. Chairman, another way to put it would be Merry Christmas, Alan, but Happy New Year.
All right, so I think it's now time for public comment, Dave. I don't know if questions or comments have come in.
We do have a couple, Chair, but if I may suggest, we still have the report from the MSAB co-chairs relevant to the topic as well, which may help clarify some of the issues before public comment.
Thank you for keeping me on track. I always get ahead of myself. I had already skipped to the next page on the agenda. My apologies to the MSAB co-chairs. As you point out, Dave, I'll turn to them. And we can hear from our co-chairs.
Thank you. So the Secretariat will give the mic to Mr. Adam Kaiser, and standing in for Carrie McGillard, I believe, is Rachel. Microphone and video capabilities are provided. See, my mic's not working now.
Okay. I can hear you, Dave. Can folks hear me now?
Yes. So
I can hear you fine, Adam.
If the Secretary could also activate Rachel Baker's microphone and camera. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Give Rachel a moment here to connect. And actually, while we're doing that, maybe I can start with a couple of opening statements. First of all, I think this will be pretty brief. It's the benefit of following Dr. Hicks. There's not a whole lot left to say. Everything's taken care of by and large. And maybe start with that acknowledgement that many thanks are extended to the staff and in particular to Dr. Hicks for the work they've done over the past number of years with the MSc process. I'd also like to extend thanks to Dr. Karen McGilliard as the co-chair. As Dr. Wilson indicated, she's not able to attend here today, but Rachel Baker has stepped in. I think this is a good example of kind of the collaborative process that the MSAB can demonstrate. Rachel has joined us there. And finally, I'd like to extend my thanks to the stakeholders who have participated in this process, some of them for a number of years. They've all made very significant contributions to a process that really is their process as a stakeholder-driven initiative. So with those acknowledgements, I will get going here. Anything, Rachel, you'd like to add for some opening statements?
No, I think you've covered it, Adam. I was just going to say that I am sitting in for Carrie, who can't be with us today, and so go right ahead. Thanks.
And I realize one operational piece. I guess I'm advancing the slides here. Yes, great. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think this will be a brief presentation. There's a lot of duplications here from what Dr. Hicks has just presented. I think it's still useful to have the duplications in the PowerPoint, at least for posterity. So some background, as we have for the past number of years, the MSAB has met twice formally in 2020 in spite of COVID. We maybe we're the first ones to, within the IPHC subsidiary processes, to go through an entirely virtual meeting. And I personally was pleasantly surprised at how effective the process had been. I think that's largely a credit to the Secretariat staff for turning things on so quickly. The group also did have some ad hoc working group meetings throughout 2020 to deal with some kind of intersessional pieces. These meetings are not decision-making meetings, the ad hoc meetings, but they are an opportunity to try to keep us on track with our efforts. Anything you want to flag there, Rachel? So this slide 3, really is the whole package. It feels strange to try to put half a dozen years worth of work into one slide, but this is our attempt. So the key deliverables from 2020 specifically, but really the broader MSc process, is that one, we've defined some objectives and candidate management procedures, many of which the commissioners have seen multiple times over the past couple of years. We have then reached some agreement that management procedures can be data-driven, like just with the FISS. They can be policy-driven, things like relative harvest rates, or some combination of both, which is what we see most often. Third accomplishment was identifying these 11 candidate management procedures which were evaluated, and Dr. Hicks had just presented. Fourth is that we identified that all of the candidate management procedures, the 11 that were proposed, met our conservation objectives, notwithstanding some of the distribution objectives for regulatory area 4 Bravo. We'll get more into this piece a little bit later, but commissioners may recall the model parameterization issues that may have led to that regulatory area 4B objective. The fifth item is we acknowledge the intent of a management strategy evaluation is to evaluate the relative performance of MPs, essentially ranking MPs against one another, and a ranking process was attempted. And then the upshot of all of this was, given the comparable conservation performance among these MPs, the advice really comes down to trade-offs between regulatory areas. Rachel?
Yeah, thanks. I think the only thing I would highlight is in number 5, the attempt at ranking that the MSAB did. And I would just say, essentially, we had one meeting to do that. And I think some of the issues related to ranking came up earlier in the question and answer with Dr. Hicks. And so just highlighting that the MSAB struggled with some of those same issues in terms of the ranking. So thanks for highlighting it in the slide, Adam.
Great. So again, slide 3 is really the summary of everything. The subsequent slides in this presentation will go through these items 1 through 6. This is mostly a procedural piece about what exactly we covered in the different MSAB meetings. I don't think there's anything new we need to add here. Sorry, this is one thing that was not within the summary that I forgot to flag at the beginning. Specifically, we had an intersessional meeting in mid-August. The specific intent of this meeting was to provide MSAB members an opportunity to review the results that were available. Initially, we had anticipated results being available in the May 2020 meeting, but those results were not available at that meeting. And in addition to that, there's been a number of obstacles to effective stakeholder engagement related to COVID. And so the secretary, Secretary very graciously agreed to accommodate some additional engagement by holding this August meeting. This meeting allowed the MSAB members to see some results and essentially have a second iteration of evaluation, both this session and the October 2020 session. So the point of slide 5 is to flag that there have been some hurdles in terms of engagement with constituents, and as I think folks can understand, there's a lot of information here, so that engagement is very important. We have tried to address those concerns, but I think I'd need to look to stakeholders, whether it's Conference Board, PAB, or others, to ensure they've got a good understanding of this information. Rachel, I'm sorry, I guess you can't see. I'll look to you. I'm not sure the best way to indicate anything to add.
I'll just speak up.
Perfect. Okay, so the first item, just to reiterate, we have the commissioners have adopted a set of objectives. We've defined a set of candidate management procedures. For reference, one could follow the hyperlinks within the presentation here. No need to spend any more time on that, I think. The second item is that the MSAB had agreement or reached agreement that management procedures can be data-driven, policy-driven, or some combination. It's trying to find the right combination of these elements to compose an MP that really was the biggest piece of work, I think, for the group. Next item, which is a bit of a specific spin-off to that point, was that the MSAB noted that the FIS survey is currently the best method for estimating stock distribution amongst the regions. And then the MSAB agreed that FIS-derived distribution for TCEY can be a component of a management procedure. So that's an example of a data-driven procedure. And then additional policy considerations or some can be combined to produce a candidate MP.
Yeah, and I think I think that came to the fore in this presentation because those issues were fairly extensive discussions at the MSAB meeting, number 16, and so I think there was disagreement, quite frankly, among different MSAB members about potentially best ways for doing allocations, and we just really wanted to highlight that these were the things in paragraphs 37 and 38 that we could agree on, and so I think.
Agreed. Yeah, I think there was nothing new. There was no surprises in the process, but it was helpful, in my opinion, to have had an opportunity for a pretty frank conversation about these different aspects. So the third item to flag is that, and most of the effort this year was spent defining distribution components of the management procedure. As Dr. Hicks had mentioned, there's 11 candidate procedures that were evaluated, and there was quite a range of elements considered when distributing TCEY. This is not an exhaustive list on the screen. One ought to refer to Appendix 5 of the MSAB 15 report. But some examples are the interim agreement, adjustments of relative harvest rates, using solely survey distribution, or some combination of shares, whether they're rolling averages, some fixed time frame, or others. The fourth item was, once we had taken the objectives, taken the candidate management procedures, the MSE team had run through the evaluation, that results were presented. And the results demonstrated that all of the candidate management procedures met the conservation objectives that the Commission has adopted. This is notwithstanding that one exception with Regulatory Area 4 Bravo, which we identified as needing some additional examination by the MSE team. So given that we have objectives, we have the management procedures, an evaluation was done showing the conservation objectives being satisfied, we're stuck with the problem of how do we pick MPs, how do we recommend MPs, and how do we rank them? We acknowledge that that the intent of an MSE is to rank these MPs, examining their relative performance, and that a ranking was attempted. The challenge is, as Rachel alluded to at the beginning of this conversation, we didn't have a lot of time to talk about rankings, and the ranking process as its current iteration may exaggerate some differences between management procedures, and I think commissioners had already commented on this in the previous agenda item. So the rank values, the takeaway for me is that the rank values not necessarily indicate the magnitude of difference in performance between MPs. Nonetheless, a ranking was provided, and this is the reason that a tier of management procedures were put forward as opposed to identifying rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, etc. I think this is really an area of future work if a ranking process is intended to be used to identify the best management procedure.
Right, and the MSAB did talk a little bit about potential other options for ways to rank management procedures, but I think another important issue that came to me anyway through this discussion was that when you sort of roll up all of the different performance metrics for the results for each of these management procedures, you can, under any ranking system, you can lose some of the nuances in differences among regulatory areas, as it were, as one big example. And so it is important to look at the results for all of the performance metrics for all the management procedures. So while we can rank by rolling up to some degree, I don't think we'll completely get away from looking at some of the more detailed performance results. That's what I learned anyway from the most recent meeting.
Okay, so as we've alluded to, the MSAB did put forward a ranking, but rather than ranking individual MPs, we advanced a tier of MPs that generally had comparable performance across them, albeit different reasons that they performed better or worse. So the Tier 1 management procedures are on the screen here. I don't think I'm going to take a whole lot of time to actually go through the specific components of them. I think the key components have been highlighted by Dr. Hicks. Look to Rachel to see if there's anything in particular I think we ought to flag here. Okay. So the takeaway, the summary for this Tier 1 is really noted in paragraph 46 of our report, that we noted Tier 1 management procedures generally maintain the spawning biomass closer to the defined target, objective 2.1, that they limited catch variability for multiple regulatory areas, and they provided a higher yield in multiple regulatory areas relative to the other tiers, Tier 2 and Tier 3. And the MSAB's recommendation, although we use the verb endorsed here, the MSAB endorsed Tier 1 as being the highest ranked management procedures from the current iteration of the MSE process. So the sixth and final takeaway point here was that given there's comparable performance relative to the conservation objectives for these management procedures, the advice is going to come down to selecting trade-offs at the regulatory area level when considering yield and variability. I think this was very well captured by Dr. Hicks in his presentation. I don't know that we have a whole lot more to add. I also think it's not terribly surprising that this is kind of the conclusions of the process. I would say I personally am really happy with the amount of, with how far this process has come in terms of trying to identify a set of scientifically defensible management procedures that not only deal with complex conservation objectives for complex fishery, but also get into really challenging conversations about allocation. I'm hopeful that this process has given commissioners the advice that they're seeking in terms of trying to satisfy conservation objectives, but also trying to resolve some complex allocation discussions. There's definitely more work to be done, but given the size of the issue, how complex the problem is, I think we've come a long way.
I would agree with that, and I think I don't have a lot to add to that, Adam, other than I think it is somewhat remarkable when you look at the really, I think Dr. Hicks referred to it as the busy figure with some of the results of the MSE, that there are lots of different results, but they all of the MPs we looked at met the conservation objectives, and I think therefore that just really highlighted again for me the different options we have within the different MPs we looked at, but we're always going to fundamentally meet that conservation objective, and so I just always try to keep that in mind. I didn't quite understand, quite frankly, that we would have that much flexibility, and looking at 11 management procedures really highlighted that for some of us on the MSAB.
Okay, so the one point where I feel like the MSAB could have done more, or at least desired to do more, but did not have the time, was to talk about what the future of the process may look like. We did put forward a few comments, maybe not recommendations, but a few comments on future work for 2021 and beyond. And these are summarized in the next two slides. Specifically, the MSAB agreed that to incorporate additional management procedures and analysis, that this should be occurring after we have some recommendations from the annual meeting. We acknowledged there was likely going to be more feedback from commissioners and from stakeholders about things that we missed or modifications to the 11 MPs that should be evaluated. So we thought there'd be value in incorporating additional MPs and identifying additional analysis after the annual meeting had occurred. And we did identify in a pretty broad way a number of proposed topics for future work. So some examples here include improving the estimation models and data generation, really dealing with some of the uncertainty comments that were put forward in the evaluation by Dr. Trevor Branch. We also identified some of the continuing need for outreach or communication tools with stakeholders, as this is a complex topic and it's difficult, it's challenging to communicate with folks who maybe only touch on this topic once a year or every other year. May not have all the background. The MSAB also did recommend a few modified management procedures for analysis to occur in 2021. And these are, I think, roughly in line with what I think I'd heard Commissioner Oliver put forward. So the MSAB was aware of these discussions and suggested this is something that would be good as part of the 2021 program of work. We had a lot of discussion about this point. Okay.
We did, and I guess just for clarification, I would highlight these recommendations in paragraph 53 do look quite similar, A and B, and so I'm not sure if it's clear to the commissioners, but recommendation 53A is for MPJ in combination with a fixed TCEY of 1.65 million pounds in regulatory area 2A, as the commissioners agreed to whenever, I'm sorry, I wasn't here when that happened, but the agreement through 2022, I think, a fixed TCEY versus in paragraph B, we had some discussion at the MSAB that apparently the intent of the 1.65 million pound TCEY in regulatory area 2A from some of the stakeholders was that 1.65 million pounds would be a minimum with the option for it to increase if possible. So the MSAB did recommend those two MPs for analysis.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rachel. I think that's also a good example of kind of the how far into the weeds the discussions need to get to really ensure that we've captured those ideas completely, and that's part of the reason why the process does take the amount of time and effort that it's required. But I still believe it's a constructive product in the end. So with that, takes us to our final slide. Although, if I may, I'd rather conclude on that summary slide, slide 3, which I think is a good place to reflect on. I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam and Rachel, for that very informative presentation. I'll just see what questions commissioners will have for you. Maybe while others are thinking about that, I have a question and maybe a comment. On your future work slide, Adam, I guess what I take from all that is basically that the MSAB is of the view that the MSAB work is not complete. And maybe I just offer a comment. I guess for myself, I think, as I said earlier, a lot of work has been already accomplished by the MSA team and the MSAB. I do think that there are other areas to explore through the MSAB, and from my point of view, I would like to see the MSAB develop a work plan and come back to the annual meeting, if possible, with what they think should be included in that form of work. I don't know if that's possible between now and the annual meeting, but I guess I'd like you to consider that. But before you do, I would seek support of the other commissioners, obviously, before having you go off and do that. So I see, Bob, you have a question or comment?
Yes, with regards to the slide that had the A and the B for MPJ, could you go back to that? So my question, Paul, is A MPJ here under A different than the one that was previously run and is mentioned as J? Is there something in here that is added?
So sorry, Commissioner Allison, just to clarify the question, is it that, is this MPJ the same MPJ that we discussed previously?
Yeah, that
right.
was ranked
so
in the previous slide.
This proposal, although I may look to Rachel to confirm, is that MPJ performed in a certain way, as we noted in the previous slides and from the presentation by Dr. Hicks. Some MSAB members said, well, MPJ, it gets us pretty close, but it's missing some other important components, some other maybe unstated objectives. Specifically, it doesn't ensure that regulatory area 2A receives that minimum of 1.65. So could we modify MPJ to take one component of the commissioner's interim agreement and add it to MPJ? So that was one proposal. During the course of that conversation, though, folks realized actually there was multiple interpretations about what the 2A agreement actually meant and how it was being implemented. So that's why there's some there's different subsections in this paragraph. So to sum up, yes, it's the same MPJ that's proposed to be modified, but there was a few different modifications that arose from that conversation. Did I capture that fairly, Rachel?
Yes, you did, and the only minor thing I would add is that my understanding is that the operating model and the scenarios that the MSE team ran for the results used a fixed TCEY, so as in paragraph 53A. So that's how the conversation started on that. So thank you.
Is the difference between A and B then allowing the
Correct.
1.65 to potentially increase? Okay.
Thanks,
you.
Bob. Chris.
A couple of things, Mr. Chairman. I think that was always, I believe, the spirit of that original agreement, that 1.65 was a floor. If the biology indicated it could be exceeded, then we'd cross that bridge then. But I think it was always meant as a floor. But this is a little bit, this 53 though from the MSAB doesn't include the 5-year, using the rolling 5-year average for the survey, which I thought was part of that original 53. And my other question was for you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't quite sure I understood your question to the MSAB co-chairs about a work plan, because I was struggling with kind of the cart and the horse that it might be more prudent to wait until the intersessional and the annual meeting to see what the commissioners want and see what we have on the table for that. Maybe I misunderstood your question.
No, I don't think so. I was thinking that it would be useful to hear from MSAB of what they think additional work would be important to undertake. And I guess, Chris, that would help us as commissioners at our intersessional meeting to have a view expressed by the MSAB of what they see a program of work could look like for 2021 and beyond. So I guess that would help us as commissioners decide on which direction that we want to go and provide direction back.
I now for a couple follow-ups.
Did I
following
answer your
up
question, Chris? Did I answer your question, Chris?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I misusing my mic button again. Yes, thank you for the clarification.
Okay. Adam.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Just to clarify with Commissioner Oliver's question, the recommendation in paragraph 53, as it's currently stated, does not include that rolling 5-year average. I'd look to Dr. Hicks and the MSE team about the ability to incorporate that additional element. I think that's a helpful clarification, because we wouldn't want them to, Secretariat to go off and do follow, say, the MSAB's recommendation, but realize there's actually a different iteration that the commissioners are looking for. I think getting some clarity for that to the MSE team would be helpful. In terms of your question about future work, Commissioner Ryall, the MSAB's request was noted in paragraph 58 that we request a meeting be scheduled to discuss the program of work for 2021 and beyond. I don't, speaking for myself, I think it may be possible to have a bit of a brainstorming meeting before the annual meeting, but I think that's, while it might be possible, it's going to be pretty challenging and may not be that informative beyond what has already been noted in some previous paragraphs. I draw attention to paragraph 57, which identified some items for future work, and referred actually to subsequent paragraphs that list some specific examples. So I would offer that first, is I don't I don't think a meeting would be terribly productive before the annual meeting. And feeling like I'm passing a hot potato, the other thing that comes to mind is some of the SRB's recommendations yesterday, specifically that in the SRB's perspective, an analyst would be well suited to identify what they feel are the kind of the key uncertainties, those inflection points that are really going to change the outcomes. And look to Alan and Dr. Stewart to say, these are some of the key uncertainties that would be their top priorities from a science perspective, and the MSAB could also identify some policy items that they feel like would be key items.
Okay. I'll just hold off now. Dr. Hicks, I see that Richard has a comment or question, and then following that, Bob does.
I'm just getting back to, thank you.
Over to you, Richard.
Getting back to that MPJ and clarifications about the rolling average that was in the original, I think, MPJ. I think Alan mentioned in his discussion about D and J that J could also perform better if the SPR could be varied instead of 43 to maybe 42 or 41, that might make that harvest, that management procedure perform better in one of the columns. Is that something that you discussed at MSAB, or this is something that, Alan, you just off the top of your head interjected as a potential thing to have analyzed in the model?
I'll look to Dr. Hicks for that. Well, let's see, unpaused. I realize I misspoke. MPJ is the rolling average. I've mixed up MPJ with MPK. I think Alan will correct me there.
Yes. Thanks, Commissioner Yamada. That's correct. Is the MSAB did have some discussion, a small amount of discussion about the yield that occurs from the SPR values. What was provided in the results were SPR values of 46%, 43%, and 40%. So we did not have specific results with 42 and 41, but interpolating between 43 and 40, there was a small amount of discussion at the MSAB that the performance of a management procedure compared to another at the same SPR, that performance may differ if they had differing levels of SPR, and that really wasn't examined a whole lot. It's a whole nother axis to bring in, more simulations to do. But I just wanted to make sure that that was noted, that if the concern was MPJ has a slightly lower yield, well, you can increase the SPR, bring the yield up, and they may perform similarly, but with different input SPRs.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Bob, I don't think you now have a question. I see your hand down, but put it back up if you do have a question. And then over to you, Chris.
No, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry if I had my hand up. I'm misusing my button again. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So what I'm hearing from Adam is that it would be a challenge to get a MSAB meeting to get between now and the annual meeting to have some meaningful input to our discussions, Chris. And so I guess what I take from that is that maybe we should narrow our focus for our intersessional discussion, and maybe that we as commissioners think about some additional work that we may like to see, and then bring that forward at the annual meeting, rather than having the MSAB come to us in January with what they see the work plan.
I do agree with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chris. I don't see any other questions from commissioners. I'll just go back to you, Adam and Rachel, and see if there's anything else that you wanted to add before we close this off.
Nothing new, just maybe reiterate my appreciation once more for the Secretariat and for the MSAB members in particular who have, this is maybe not this is not necessarily the end of the MSc, but it's definitely the end of a chapter, and it's really good to see it here. Thanks very much to the MSc team and the MSAB members for their years of work.
I would just second that, and particularly give my thanks to the MSE team for being remarkably responsive and supportive to the MSAB members with our questions and providing us tools to evaluate the results. So very much appreciated.
Thanks, Adam and Rachel, for your report on MSAB, and likewise, Dr. Hicks, for your presentation earlier. I think, as a number of have said, and I'll just close off with it, I think we've come a long way from when we started down this road, and we see it in the presentations that we've had today that's provided us some really, I think, important information on management procedures across a suite of 11 and the objectives that have been developed by MSAB to test those against. I think it's really important and good work that's being provided to the Commission to make some decisions going forward. With that, Dave, I think we are now at a point for public comment and questions. So do you have those ready to go?
Yes, Chair, we'll project those. So we have 4 or 5 stakeholders who would like to make questions or comments. So if we could maximize that on the screen, Secretariat. For the first comment or written comment is from Peggy Parker, and it relates to 8.2, the MSc peer review. And so the topic reads, I just wanted to note, comments aside, that the Commissioner's mission goes well beyond catch limits and have a closer relationship between final catch limits and scientific recommendations is compelling. Dr. Branch's explanation on why international management bodies may want those guardrails on catch limits was interesting. A general comment there. The next is from Linda Benken of Alpha, again relating to agenda item 8. And the topic is, Alpha appreciates the work of the Management Strategy Evaluation and Management Strategy Advisory Board. The process has been essential to moving the Commission toward a consistent harvest policy, and we are in support of continuing the MSAB work. Alpha notes that the MSAB process has informed stakeholders, and we expect commissioners on the impacts of various management procedures. Alpha requests that the commissioners recommend the following, and there are a series of 5 recommendations there. I'm going to read through these very quickly. So the first is that the MSE team continue to make technical improvements to the model. Consensus agreement from paragraph 25 of the MSAB report. Only Tier 1 MPs be advanced for future consideration. Tier 1 MPs best meet Commissioner objectives. Dr. Hicks run MPJ, Management Procedure J, using a 5-year rolling average for the FIS, and with the US paying for £1.65 million floor for Area 2A. Consensus agreement from paragraph 53 of the MSAB 16 report. The MSE team conduct additional model runs to better understand equal HRs. Consensus agreement from paragraph 54 of the MSAB 16 report. The MSE team begin work to explore impacts of bycatch. U26 soil sizes in one regulatory area on GCY and other regulatory areas. This is IPHC Commission Consensus Agreement from IM096. And we have a comment and a couple of questions from Dan Falvey, also from Alpha, relating to agenda item 8. So the first question is, do MSC model projections across a range of high and low halibut abundant states indicate that 2B's relative percent of coastwide TCEY will approach 20% using only the O32 abundance within Canadian waters and current relative harvest rates? If not, is it correct to conclude, based on MSC model results, that including a 20% fixed share component in the 2B distribution formula effectively requires the US to transfer yield generated by halibut residing within US waters to Canada on a long-term basis during times of both high and low abundance? And before I pass to Dr. Hicks to respond, I'm going to read the second question. Slide 25 shows the effect of increased fishing pressure on Region 2 spawning biomass. Contrasting management procedure G and F, it looks like there is about a 3+% absolute decrease in spawning biomass, which translate into about 17% to 19% relative decrease between MPG and MPF. Is that a correct interpretation of that slide? Also, since spawning biomass is closely related to O32 abundance, is it correct to conclude that the relative percentage of O32 biomass and relative percentage of coastwide TCEY in 2A and 2C based on O32 survey abundance and current relative HRs would decrease by a similar amount? So over to you, Dr. Hicks, to respond.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Those are very specific questions. I've had about 5-10 minutes to look at these since they were asked or posted in the public comments. So I'll be brief with them and try to get to the main points of them. Question number 1 is a good question. The first thing is that the objectives based on yield and stability are all short-term objectives, and so everything was analyzed in the short term of the simulations, and it is useful to also look at the long-term effects of this. Another benefit of the MSC simulations is that the MSC simulations have a lot of this variability in it. And so they're integrating over high and low abundance scenarios or simulations. So the MSC results are perfect to answer this question, in other words, and that it's looking at high and low states and integrating over those. And if I may share my screen just really briefly, I'll show you the Msc Explorer that we can look at this, if it's possible, with the Secretariat. And while we're trying to set that up, I can continue answering the question. Okay. Just confirmation that you can see my screen.
See your screen, Alan, but the font's pretty small.
Is that a little bit better like that? And if it's not,
it might be helpful a bit bigger.
Okay. I can do it like this. I'll talk to it, and if you can see it, you can also maximize that pod window in Adobe Connect briefly while I show this. But just to be brief, is the Msc Explorer can now explain MPF, here shown at the top, is the one with the 20% national share from Canada. And MPG is our current interim management procedure without any agreement. So no agreements, no rules for 2B or 2A. So it's just distribution and relative harvest rates. And that can give us an idea how the yield changes between these two areas or regions. And so I think I might actually try to answer both of these questions at the same time. I'm going to look at the different region 2 and regulatory area 2, and this is really the benefit. What I'm showing here is median average TCY on a coastwide level, and then in region 2, and then in regions 2A, 2B, and 2C. And what you can see is, yes, in region 2B, with the agreement of 20%, the TCY increases from about 4 million pounds to 10 million pounds on average in the long term. And that is also at the cost of decreases in 2C and 2A. And it's actually, if we were to look at other regulatory areas decrease as well. So that's just a general result that we noticed from this. So yes, in the long term, over high and low states, and if we wanted, we could look at 5% and 95% confidence intervals to get those high and low states. You will find that the 20% does, national share does result in an increase in 2B and a decrease in the other regulatory areas, which is the trade-off that we want to see. I want to turn on one more, it's already on. The median percent spawning biomass in region 2, and this might be getting at question 2, which you could also see this result up here at the top in slide 25, I believe it was, is yes, the percentage of biomass, spawning biomass in region 2 declines with the national share in 2B and the agreement of 1.65 for regulatory area 2A. However, there's not a conservation concern, and you can actually see what's interesting is that the probability of being less than that target is actually less, slightly less, when you have that national share. So there's less spawning biomass in region 2, but on a coastwide level, matching, there's less probability of going below the target of 36%. And there's actually a very, very slight, which is probably, within that. It's hard to say if this is true or an actual just simulation error. Very slight increase in the coastwide TCY, including that national share in 2B. But I would more say that the coastwide TCY is insignificantly different, looking at such a small change in there. So there, again, there's a lot of trade-offs here, and these are dependent on the migration assumptions. I am going to just briefly look back at the questions, which actually I can't see unless I stop sharing my screen. So I just look at the questions and make sure that I am answering those well. I think one, so yes, it is over high and low states, the 2B distribution formula does result in decreases in other regulatory areas. And in slide 2 is, yes, that is a correct interpretation of the slide, and we saw that about 3% change. And then I would note that the spawning biomass is closely related to O32 abundance, but as Dr. Stewart showed yesterday, O32 abundance is different than spawning biomass. And he showed that with what the fishery is encountering and what the spawning biomass is encountering in terms of age classes. So I don't think they're congruent, and you can't make the same assumptions from each of them. However, it is a good way. Using the Msc Explorer, you can actually look at what the TCYs in 2A and 2C are. And I suspect they do change about the same amount as the spawning biomass, but not going to be exactly the same. That's what I have for those.
Thank you very much, Alan. The next question is again from Dan Falby from Alpha, same agenda item. Looking at Msc Explorer tool using the long-term median average TCY metric for all IPHC reg areas under management procedures B, D, and E, I can see how the median average TCY is reduced in Alaskan IPHC reg areas between MPE and MPB because of the need to transfer TCY from Alaska to 2A and 2B on an annual basis to compensate for the increases. MPD, however, has almost the same reduction in long-term yield to Alaska as MPB, yet MPD does not contain an annual compensation requirement. What is the cause of this? And then secondly, is it correct to conclude, based on MSC model results, that including a 20% fixed percentage of coastwide TCY in the 2B formula has a long-term negative impact on yield in US IPHC regulatory areas caused by either an annual reduction to compensate for the 2B increase or through a long-term reduction in coastwide yield if F43 is allowed to be exceeded? So over to you again, Dr. Hicks.
I'll need to share my screen on this one again if that's possible. And while that's coming up, that's a very insightful question for sure. And it shows, one, the benefit of having this tool like the Msc Explorer for stakeholders, commissioners, and others to use and to examine. But it also shows that it makes questions for me very difficult. So yeah, so I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to show this. I'm just going to set this up real quick, noting that the question was, oh, I hate it when I do that, was looking at MP B, D, and A. So as a reminder, B is our current interim agreement with the agreements for 2A and 2B, but a constraint at the coastwide level. D is those same things, but allowing the fishing intensity to increase to accommodate those agreements. E is actually our current interim agreement without the 2B agreement, but does have the 2A agreement in it. But I think the gist of this question is really to look at what is causing a difference in the yield in some of these areas, and what is, even though D is allowing the fishing intensity increase and accommodate those, why are the results sort of similar? And we'll look to see if they are similar between the two. I'm just going to turn off a few things to make it easier for to see the results, especially zoomed in like this. There's the median AAV, and we'll turn off these. Just make sure that the median annual TCY is on, and we'll see with the table. So we have B, D, and E, and I did turn it off accidentally. Sorry about that. This is also the problem of, there it is, median average TCY. So many performance metrics, it can make it a bit daunting to navigate this. So a couple of things that I want to note first is we have here the probability of going below that target. This is a nice just reference to look at. You can see with MPD that we have a higher probability of going below that target, and that's because we're allowing that higher fishing intensity. So we are potentially driving the stock to lower levels. So what's the effect of that? You can see on the coastwide level that results in slightly more, and this is all in the long term, different than the short-term objectives. This is looking at the long term, but I think it gets at the question. And so you can see that drives the coastwide TCY in the long term to be at a slightly lower level than, say, B or E with or without the agreement of 2B. The TCY in 2A remains the same because that's held at a constant 1.65. But what you notice, the difference here is that in 2B, we have an agreement for 2B. We have an agreement with allowed increased fishing intensity, and it's slightly less in MPD for 2B, and then it's much less in E because we do not have that agreement for 2B. And then similarly for 2C, we show without the agreements 2C has a higher TCY and then a much lower TCY even allowing for the agreements by the increased fishing intensity. And so to answer the question, what this is showing you is that the agreement does remove TCY from other regulatory areas, both the 2A and 2B agreements, as you would expect. So it's not only 2C that would decline. We can take a quick look at that. I'll just throw in 3A. And so you can see it's 22 here down to the 20 million pounds. So there's that trade-off there. But the interesting thing is, even with MPD allowing for the agreement by increasing the fishing intensity, in the long term, what is happening is the stock is driven to lower levels, and therefore at those lower levels, even the coast-wide TCY is reduced, and that translates into reductions among all regulatory areas other than 2A, which is held fixed. So that reduction, that higher fishing intensity, even results in a reduction in 2B. So I hope that illustrates that question, but also illustrates the complexity of interpreting these results. And it's another point that I must say, I've been very happy to have the help of the MSAB, the insights of the MSAB, and the different points of view from the MSAB to help the MSE team interpret these results.
Thank you very much. The final question, comment is from Malcolm Milne of the North Pacific Fisheries Association. Is the MSE able to quantify the differences in yield to other regulatory areas with and without the interim 730 rule for 2B, as well as the interim rule for 2A? And back to you.
Yes, it is. And if you take a look at slide 10 in the presentation, I won't show that again, but if you take a look at slide 10, it shows those elements within each of the MPs. And at the very bottom are those agreements for 2A and 2B. What you will notice is that MPG, as in Gulf, is a management procedure using the current interim with a constraint at the coastwide level, but without those agreements. And that could be compared directly to MPB to get an idea of the effect of both agreements. You could also compare that to MPE to show the effect of only the 2A agreement. And then you can compare it to MPF to show you a national share of 20% for 2B. So the benefit of the slide 10 table is you can see that those are available. And yes, to answer your question specifically, both of those comparisons are available between MPs B, E, F, and G.
Thank you very much. And so I'll pass back to the Chair. That's the end of the public questions and comments that we've received. Back to you, Chair.
All right. Thanks very much, Dave, for taking us through that. Looking at the agenda, we had on Agenda 9 contracting party updates, but as we talked about yesterday, there were not any at that time, and I don't think that has changed. Is that correct, Dave?
So that agenda item is
all
empty.
Right. And so that would take us to the next agenda item 10, IPHC fishery regulation proposals for 2020 and 21. I would go back to you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sorry, Chris.
Mr. Chairman?
Go. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just a comment before you move on. Harkening back to the discussion we had earlier about next steps on this agenda item 8, and I launched the commissioners into a discussion ahead of our MSAB co-chair reports, ahead of public comment. I apologize for that. But having heard those reports and those comments, there's some really good comments and questions. I don't think anything I heard would change what we discussed earlier, and the path forward that we discussed will enable us to accommodate and consider those things that we heard. So apologize for jumping the gun, but sometimes I think it's all right. Better be lucky than good. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to take about a 10-minute break from the proceedings, so to take another call, but I'll be back very shortly.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Back to you, Dave.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Davis and Commissioner DeGrief may also have their hands raised.
Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
Davis?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Didn't pay attention to that side of my screen. So, Neil, you had a comment or question?
Yeah, if we have time to, I wanted to also go back and make sure I understand Alan's responses to one of the questions. I think it was Dan Falvey's second set of questions, and Alan, you brought up a screen that showed some metrics comparing B, D, and E. If we could, Alan,
Davis,
yeah.
would you like to see that screen again? Sure. If this could have the sharing option, thank you.
So it was this biological sustainability objective. I wanted to make sure I had heard your analysis of this correctly. So this is the probability of all relative spawning biomass. So this is the probability of all relative spawning biomass.
Sorry, Commissioner Davis, I'm not sure if you've cut out.
Can you hear me now, Dr. Hicks?
Can you hear me now, Dr. Hicks? I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. So it was this biological sustainability objective in the comparison of the scenarios. Can you walk us through how to interpret the values here again? I thought it was the case that we wanted to be closer to 0.5 in the probability. That was the positive indicator, but in the way you'd characterize them, it seems to me that it was the reverse. So I wanted to be clear on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis, and a very good follow-up. Yeah, I did not mean to indicate that this number was worse or better than any of the other numbers. And in fact, you're right. The objective related to the target of 36% is to maintain the biomass around the target, meaning being above it 50% of the time and below it 50% of the time. And what MPD actually does is it does get you closer to that target given the input SPR 43%. So this is telling you the probability that the relative spawning biomass is less than 36%. If we were to match that objective exactly, this would be 0.5. So MPD in our ranking table actually ranks higher than B or E because of that case. To get at Richard's question, or Commissioner Yamada's question, if I may, earlier, and I apologize for now all this numbers up there, is what I've done is put in SPR 40%, put in a higher fishing intensity. And what you can see here is if you look at D, a very high probability of being less than 36%. But in, say, Management Procedure B, now we're closer to that 50 than we were with a 43. And that was where my point was coming from, is that, say, a 41 or a 42 in between there would put us about the same. And so to just finalize that, an SPR of 42% might perform very similarly in terms of this objective as MPD with an input SPR of 43%. And sorry, I could talk about this stuff all day, so I apologize if that was a lengthy answer, Commissioner Davis. I'm not hearing any.
Neil, did you have any follow-up?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you.
All right, Peter?
Yeah, this was a question for Dr. Hicks as well. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. A couple of times you mentioned looking at migration and future and changing the migration values, I assume. I'm just curious, can you delve?
Sure. Another great question, Commissioner DeGrief, is that, well, part of an MSE is to examine the robustness of a management procedure. So the parameterization of migration in this operating model is a hypothesis, basically. We're fitting it to data, the best data that we have, but we do have a lot of uncertainty about migration, which is one of the reasons the stock assessment has not moved towards a multi-area model. The benefit of management strategy evaluation is we can examine the effect of management procedures given different hypotheses. What we have now in this operating model is a small range of hypotheses. We have uncertainty on the migration. We've introduced migration as different depending on the PDO. So it's a really good first step at understanding the Pacific halibut population and potential hypotheses of migration. But there are other hypotheses that we should be examining just to make sure that these management procedures perform as expected. And the example there are the relative harvest rates. If, for example, the operating model is inappropriately or is mischaracterizing migration in the future, what might happen in the future with migration and movement of halibut, then those results of relative harvest rates and could be incorrect, and we could be either harvesting too high in those areas or too low, depending on that. And we just want to see if migration was different. If it was on this hypothesis, let's say that a lot of fish hardly move between the areas, or very few fish move between the areas, and contrast that with a lot of fish moving between areas, what do these management procedures look like then? And it's really to characterize our uncertainty in the migration.
Okay, it's not due to new evidence, but you just want to test robustness. I get that. Yeah, okay. So is this a change within the operating model? Is this is that what you're referring to? Just playing with, or not playing, but examining numbers within the operating model of migrate?
Yes, for now that would be what we would do without creating a whole new operating model. It's very simple to just change the parameter values, keep that 4-region concept in there, and just change how the fish move between the regions, and maybe put in some very extreme hypotheses like fish don't move at all, just to see what happens. In that case, it's not a simulation we would actually use to say, well, if fish didn't move at all, we choose this management procedure, thus we choose this management procedure. But it's to say, hey, look, if we're deciding between 2 or 3 management procedures, this one performs over a wide range of uncertainties, performs very well, whereas this one performs well in this case, but not well in this case. It helps us identify those and just to make sure that we're comfortable in decisions that may be made in the future on a management procedure, and that we're comfortable with the uncertainty in the future of the population.
Okay, and just one last follow-up to clarify my thought. Part of the reason the migration is in there is to fit it to the model. Is that not correct? The migration numbers that are in the model were chosen to fit them. Am I missing something?
That's correct. And so when we initially parameterize and make decisions about how to build the model, we've evaluated, many years of tagging results, observations on Pacific halibut, and I will note Dr. Karpy is putting together a paper of a review of halibut movement and migration, and that's helped us just sort of put together the building blocks of halibut movement. But what we don't know, and there's a lot of uncertainty exactly how or what percentage of Pacific halibut moved from region 4 to region 3 in 2018, for example. That might vary over years. There's a lot of uncertainty there. So when we put together the operating model, we have this general structure. We have movement occurring between 4 and 3, but we need to determine how much movement occurs between 4 and 3. And to do that, we've fit to the data as best as possible, and those data being the female spawning biomass trajectory from the stock assessment ensemble, the proportion of all sizes observed in each region from FIS, the NPUE from FIS for each region as well, and there was a fourth, and I just drew a blank on it, but some sources of data that helped us identify that is where the actual migration rates in the operating model is fit to. And that's where that slide 11 or 13, whatever it was, with the blue and red trajectories is coming from that fitting process, or what's called conditioning an operating model.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Dave, back
So
to you.
move on to agenda item 10, which is the IPHC fishery regulation proposals for the 2021 process. And I'm actually going to pass this to Lara Erickson to present. So over to you, Lara.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So, and thank you, Chair. I will be presenting agenda item 10, paper 12, which is the IPHC fishery regulations and proposals for 2021. So the IPHC fishery regulation proposal is available on the IPHC website at the top link. Of note, the deadline for a regulatory proposal is the 26th of December for the 97th annual meeting, or IM096, and also that we may receive stakeholder statements up until the day before the annual meeting. IPHC Secretariat Proposal 1 and 2 allow for the 2021 mortality and fishery limits by contracting party and IPHC regulatory area, as well as the commercial fishing periods for all IPHC regulatory areas. So these are the top two that you see here. Proposal A3 is to improve clarity and consistency, and all three of these proposals may be accessed at these links on the left. So I'm actually going to attempt to go to the one to A3. Maybe I'll ask the Secretariat if they can go to the link A3. Well, or maybe you're able to do that on your own. The if you go to the link, the proposal A3, in particular, the only items that we've really added to it for this upcoming season Thank you. If you could scroll to the bottom where it has the suggested amendment or edits to the language. There. Thank you. So as you see here, the only changes that we've suggested or proposed, that we are proposing for the regulations is just to clarify that in the definition it includes the IPHC Secretariat when it refers to authorized officer, and also that in section 22 for the supervision of offloading or unloading rather and weighing Pacific halibut, that also captures the need to sample the Pacific halibut. And noting that these changes or these modifications to the text will be discussed and reviewed with NOAA Fisheries as well as Fisheries and Oceans Canada prior to the paper deadline and submission for the 97th annual meeting, which would be the 26th of December. Thank you. If we could return to the PowerPoint. So if we may advance to this slide, these are the regulatory proposals we anticipate receiving from the contracting parties. From Canada, we anticipate a regulatory proposal regarding an overage-underage option for the recreational fishery. And from the United States of America, we anticipate the regulatory proposal for the 2021 charter management measures for the recreational fisheries in IPHC regulatory areas 2C and 3A. And then finally, of note, to date, we have not received any regulatory proposals from stakeholders. Although I would like to point out to all of our stakeholders that have joined us today that the deadline for these is not until the 26th of December and that the portal is now accessible on our website. So please, if you have a regulatory proposal you'd like us to consider, please submit it there. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lara, for the presentation. Are there any questions for Lara? I'm not seeing any questions, but I guess I do have a comment. You had on your slide about the recreational proposal from Canada and a regulatory change. We, as you have identified, we have not submitted a proposal, and I would say that we're not planning on submitting a proposal for a regulatory change. We don't see how it fits in a regulatory change. However, we are still interested in exploring that option, and we'll have maybe some further comments on that at the annual meeting and or before. So I just wanted to pass that comment on. Neil, I see you have a question or a comment.
Paul, you beat me to the punch. I have nothing further to add.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Excuse me. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one thing, and it's with regard to the authorized officer proposal. We're going to ask to postpone adopting that proposed change to the definition of authorized officer, and it has nothing to do with authority per se, but rather a rather convoluted set of codified regulations that define the term authorized officer and attendant law enforcement authorities that come with that. And I don't want to get into the weeds on it, but because of those complexities, I would suggest that the Secretariat collaborate with the appropriate agency staff, and we'll identify who those are to iron out those problems. But that's come to my attention recently, so I would ask that we not adopt that proposed change until we iron that out.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. I don't see any other comments or questions. So again, thanks very much, Lara, for the presentation. Dave, are there, or is there public comment and questions for this agenda item?
Not at this point, Chair, and we can certainly take any that come in over lunch to give stakeholders or others who would like to digest that over lunch. Which means we're about 8 minutes or so from the scheduled lunch break. We could take agenda item 11, which should probably only take about 5 minutes or so, or we could break now, and I'll leave that in your hands, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. I would prefer to break now and come back at, I guess, 12:30, if that's okay. And we'll pick things up for the remainder of the agenda at 1:30.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. See you at 1:30.